Aidan McCarthy is a 2-year-old little boy with curly blonde hair, round rosy cheeks, and one of many little Jewish boys who live in Highland Park, Illinois. But in so many ways, Aidan is different than all the others, because Aidan is an orphan. His parents, Kevin and Irina, were shot and killed during the festive July 4th parade through downtown Highland Park last year. Kevin saved his son's life, shielding him under his body, which is exactly where he was rescued. He found his way into the arms of Dana Ring, my camp friend's older sister, someone I've known for 30 years. All Aidan kept asking was if Mom and Dad were going to come back soon. July 4th is meant to be a day of great celebration. We're supposed to celebrate all that was good in our nation and our founders' dreams to form a more perfect union where we and our posterity can live in domestic tranquility. Central Avenue in Highland Park was the picture of that tranquility until it became the scene of that horrific tragedy. It is a street I have walked down dozens of times. As a kid, I used to buy my shoes there. I'd eaten hot dogs there. And my family's oldest friend has his office there. As the events of July 4th unfolded, my family members and I began to call and tell each other who were the friends that we knew who were there, who had witnessed the shooting, who had run for their lives, who were shot, who were killed. Like my friend's sister Dana, who now will carry the grief of that unimaginably humane act of kindness she performed for the rest of her life, we carry the pain of that day. The events of this past July 4th were tragic in so many ways. To see this pain inflicted on what was meant to be a day of celebration adds to the anger and the anguish of its senselessness. Seeing my community torn apart in pain, knowing there was so little that I could do to bring comfort to the victims and their families, and knowing that so many more will continue to carry those emotional wounds, leave me feeling hopeless. As I process the events in the coming days, that acute hopelessness bled into the general sense that too many of us have been carrying for these past few years. That we have so much to be saddened or angered about, that we are tempted to fall into despair. It feels like the world is spinning out of control, that not only are bad things happening, but we are losing our ability to cope, and there is nothing we can do about it. As Americans, we are taught that we control our destiny. The American dream is one of self-reliance. If we are honest and we work hard, good things will happen. But our Jewish tradition sees it a bit differently. When we read Unatana Tokef, as we did this morning, we are told the decisions of who will live and who will die, who by fire and who by water, who will be troubled and who will be tranquil, are beyond our control. Our fates will come whether we like it or not, that the powers of the universe have already decided what our fates will be. When things are going well, we can celebrate. But if we look around and see pain and sadness, death and destruction, the thought that we are incapable of doing much of anything about it can lead us to despair. The problems that we face today are massive, global, interconnected, and compounding. Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine has killed, displaced, and injured so many, touching off a humanitarian crisis that the world is struggling to manage and raising fears about future calamities. The economic effects of the war have cascaded into the global financial markets, compounding already rising inflation, further disrupting a global market still reeling from the 2 years of a global pandemic. The challenge of these last 7 months, piled on top of issues like climate change, the rise of violent crime in our cities, renewed legal attacks on bodily autonomy and voting rights, and more mass shootings. All the while, our Jewish community has seen an all-time high in the number of anti-Semitic incidents, a 34% increase from last year, with a particular focus on Jewish institutions like schools and synagogues. with all of this going on, if someone were to come up to me and ask, "What's wrong?" my answer very well might be that internet gesture to say everything in particular. The exasperation that I feel when I consider the state of the world leads me wondering that even if we wanted to do something about it, where could we possibly begin? Our problems today seem so vast, so widespread, so overwhelming, that any rational person might suggest that the proper emotional response will be to throw up our hands, overwhelmed by the pain and suffering and despair, simply giving in to the whole thing. Last night, Rabbi Levin reminded us of the power of hope. Despair is the absence of that hope. Despair is tempting because it allows us to numb ourselves in a deep exhale of, oh well, nothing I can do, so it doesn't really matter. Despair can tempt us not to care about the consequences of our actions, good or bad. But this Rosh HaShanah reminds us that our actions do, in fact, always matter. Those challenging words of Unatana Tokef, which at first lay out that our fates are written, conclude with the charge that repentance and the hard work of repair, prayer and communal camaraderie, righteous acts and generosity lay the pathway around those fates towards a world of love and peace. They ask us, what will we do to bring light into a world shadowed by darkness? How do we do that? Through love. Radical love. Love expressed intentionally in all directions, and especially at those moments when we feel most challenged to love. Love is a powerful emotion. Love binds families and communities together, friends and strangers. The command to love appears over and over and over again in our Torah. Love your neighbor, love the stranger, love the Holy One. Those 3 mitzvot that are so beautifully illustrated in our congregation's Welcome Center. Love, I want to suggest, is the antidote to despair. I want to share the story of Linda Schulman. Linda raised her children well, especially her son Scott. Scott committed his life to teaching, working as a camp counselor, high school teacher, and cross-country coach. Then Linda got that phone call that every parent fears. Scott had been murdered. One of the 17 victims in the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. He was shot saving the lives of his students. Linda had to stand right here, right where I'm standing now, and eulogize her son to a crowd of people who are sitting exactly where you are sitting before we laid him to rest here in our mausoleum. I can't imagine a situation that would be more tempting to despair than the one that Linda faced. Instead, she has spent the last 4.5 years using every ounce of her energy to try to make the world safer for others. She's worked in Florida to get a red flag law passed. She goes on TV telling her story, reliving the tragedy over and over again, out of a deep sense of care and concern for all of the other parents and children. Rather than despair, she located her deep love of humanity and has chosen to express it over and over again. So too did Dr. King. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1964, he and his community were at risk of despair. The fight for civil rights was ongoing and getting more difficult each day. This was before the famous march from Selma to Montgomery, before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and just months after the murders of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner in Mississippi. In his acceptance speech, recognizing that the realities of being black in America in 1964 were bleak and morally outrageous, that the movement was nowhere near achieving the peace and justice it sought, he said, "I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. When we struggle to know what to do, when we wonder how we can help make things better, when we think things are so dark that we don't know where the light will come from, turn, Dr. King said, to love. Finding ways to love will not solve the problems, not right away. But finding ways to love helps to buoy ourselves and our spirits so that we can work to make things better. Finding ways to love our family and friends, our neighbors, the strangers among us, is a way to sublimate our frustrations and our feelings of sadness, to keep ourselves from falling into despair. These expressions of love in spite of the difficulties, love to combat the pain and anguish that we see or feel, are these acts of radical love. Radical love is love that requires us to show up for others even when it's difficult. Love that focuses on the feelings and perspectives of other people, seeing the humanness inside of us, fueled by compassion and understanding, and promoting healing and growth. It is action-oriented, and it asks us to lean on our own vulnerabilities and lead with our hearts. I learned those words from someone who lives here in Boca Raton with us, Dr. Tracy Baxley, a professor of education at FAU. Her work has focused on how parents can help raise their children to be compassionate and caring in an unjust world. Not surprising, she too is inspired by Dr. King and teaches to channel our fears and concerns into action, to be inspired to find ways to express love for ourselves, our communities, and those around us. Linda Shulman has used her outsized platform, born from personal tragedy, to change our country. But finding ways to love through the pain is something that each of us can do. We can start with ourselves and find time in this new year to take care of ourselves for self-care. If we resolve to love ourselves, we can get healthier, happier, emotionally stronger and more resilient, better fit to sustain the difficulties that the world seems destined and determined to set before us. If we pursue love of our family and our friends, we can make moments of joy and celebration, moments where we can increase our temporal happiness and enjoyment, filling our emotional reserves that have been tapped in these last few years. So many of us have been rightfully reticent to socialize during the past few years. But as new booster shots are available and the virus becomes less of a threat each day, make that time to go to dinner with friends, to go on that weekend getaway, and fill your own tank. As a congregational community, we regularly express our love of the stranger through our social action projects that befit those in need. And that love improves their experience in the world in their own lives. This year offers us new opportunities to spread the love of the stranger, like our project today collecting coats for those in Ukraine who are facing a second winter away from their homes. Something small that we can do to help a nation that needs so much love right now. And our love of the Holy One, of Ahavat Yisrael, the love of our people of Israel, inspire us to celebrate together on this day and in this new year, celebrations that express our gratitude for the gifts and blessings that we have received. There is a beautiful teaching about how our acts of love and kindness can become seeds sown to even more. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, a leader in the last century, lived his own life with significant tragedy. In 1929, his community at Hebron was massacred. He happened to be away that weekend and survived. 40 years later, in 1970, while flying home to New York after visiting Israel, his flight on TWA was hijacked. And he and his wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law were held hostage with 40 other Jews in Jordan. Today, September 26th, is the 52nd anniversary of his release. Baruch Hashem, he was able to celebrate that year's Rosh HaShanah in peace. And despite the pains and anguishes he experienced, he had the love of humanity to write that when a person receives a benefit from his fellow, a seed of chesed is planted in this world. If the nature of chesed is functioning healthily and properly, this seed cannot but give rise to another chesed. Our acts of love, Rabbi Hutner teaches, are contagious. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah, like we teach in religious school. Chesed gorer chesed. When we do something loving for another, that act can germinate and blossom into more. Maybe I like how it feels, so I do it again. Maybe the person I helped feels compelled to pay it forward. Maybe someone hears about it and decides to do the same. Maybe all three. These small kindnesses, these small acts of love to one another can domino and ripple through a family and a community, like a virus of positivity. Over time, things can begin to feel better, and maybe the ripple hits someone who has the means to do something monumental, to become a super spreader of chesed. This contagion of love is exactly what we need right now. So let us start with us. For those of you who have children, or grandchildren, or nieces and nephews, start with them. Love on them like Aidan McCarthy yearns for the love of his parents. In a moment, we will hear the sounding of the shofar. It begins with Tikiyah, our call to attention, reminding us to be ever conscious of the world around us. Next, Shevarim, the three broken blasts that sound like the crying and tears of sadness, reminding us that much is broken. And Tru'ah, the signal that it is time to act. As we hear these notes, let us know that when faced with sadness, we are called to act with love. A radical, great love, as impressive as the Tekiyah Gedolah. Shana Tova.